Let's get started. I am Eva Kirsch, Director of the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art at California State University, San Bernardino. Welcome to RAFMA's event. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. I am sure that you won't regret it, since the talk you're going to hear is truly fascinating. The event resulted from a collaboration between the two CSUSB's departments located in different colleges: the Art Museum, RAFMA, in the College of Arts and Letters, and History Department in the College of Social and Behavioral Science. I would like to thank RAFMA staff, Miranda Canseco, Laura Munoz, and Diego Irigoyen, for all your help in organizing and promoting the event. Much appreciated. I also thank our guest speaker, Dr. Justin Jacobs, and the event's host, Dr. Jeremy Murray, Associate Professor in the History Department. By the way, if you have any questions during the lecture, please use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen to post them. Dr. Jacobs will answer your questions after the talk. And now, please welcome Dr. Jeremy Murray. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the event.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'm really delighted to have this collaboration between the History Department and RAFMA and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. It gives me a great pleasure, and it's really a privilege to welcome Dr. Justin Jacobs, who is Associate Professor of History at American University in Washington, D.C. He received his bachelor's and master's of arts degrees at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he received his doctorate, his PhD in Chinese history from the University of California, San Diego. Justin is a historian of China, Xinjiang, and the Silk Road, Antiquities and Archaeology. He's the author of The Compensations of Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures, which we'll hear a little bit about today. A very recent book, just came out this past year. And also the author of Indiana Jones in History and Xinjiang and the Modern Chinese State. He teaches courses on ancient and modern China, the Japanese Empire, an introduction to Asia, and the history of archaeological expeditions. He also serves as editor of the Silk Road Journal and hosts Beyond Huaxia, a podcast on East Asian history. Dr. Jacobs is a popular educator, and through congressional testimony and popular online forums like podcasts and public videos, he's become an important voice of expertise on urgent issues in the public forum. Great thanks also go to my colleague in history, Dr. Kate Liska, for setting up this collaboration, Eva Kirsch and Miranda Canseco for their support of this event through the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art, RAFMA. Thanks also to Tiffany Jones, my department chair in history, and thanks to Dean Rafiq Mohammed, Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, for supporting this event and for all they did to make it possible. Finally, and most importantly, I'd like to thank Dr. Justin Jacobs for joining us online today to speak about his most recent work, The Compensations of Plunder. Dr. Jacobs is an enormously generous colleague and friend, and it is a great pleasure and a privilege to welcome him to share his work with the California State University, San Bernardino community. Thank you, Justin.
Hi. Thank you, Jeremy. It's a great pleasure to come here. Thank you for that generous introduction. Today, what I want to talk about is an introduction to my latest book, which came out earlier this summer, The Compensations of Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures, which I began working on some 15 years ago when Dr. Murray and I were fellow graduate students at the UC San Diego. So in order to sort of talk about how I came into this topic, trying to understand the fate of under what circumstances were the art and antiquities of China in the 20th century taken abroad. How did this happen? Who knew about it? And what did they think? Was this theft? Was this coercion? Was there corruption involved? These are all questions that I often had in the back of my mind and I was wondering about. But it actually wasn't where I began my research. I began my research actually somewhere else on a different topic. It's the same region. It's the area known as Xinjiang in what is today northwestern China, sometimes referred to in English as Chinese Turkestan, or depending on your political orientation, perhaps East Turkestan. It's been in the news a lot lately. This is where China has many of the policies, controversial policies towards Uyghurs today. But my first book took place in this part of China, and I was trying to understand during the 20th century, how did the Chinese manage to maintain unbroken political control over what is the largest non-Han region of the former Qing Empire in the 20th century, when successive Chinese republics inherited this territory? This territory today comprises about 1/6 of the entire territory of the People's Republic of China. And back at the turn of the 20th century, when many of the foreign archaeologists were doing their expeditions here, it was the population of the Chinese was chiefly in the political administration. They probably comprised no more than 5% of the entire population of this province. The remainder would have been perhaps maybe 70% Uyghurs, Turkic-speaking Muslims, Kazakhs, who were Turkic-speaking nomadic Muslims, also a smattering of Han, Chinese Muslims known as Hui, but again, no more than 5% Han. And it was when I was examining this question from the Chinese perspective, using Chinese archival sources, how did they manage to retain unbroken political control of this region when they lost places like Outer Mongolia and for a while lost de facto control over Tibet as well? And I was studying this region and coming to the conclusion that there was a shift in strategy. The 5% of the Han who chiefly worked in the official bureaucracy, they adopted shifting methods of rule. First, they tried to preserve the old system of native hereditary non-Han elites. Then they tried to integrate Uyghurs and Kazakhs into the Chinese bureaucracy, ultimately implementing what they called a version of Chinese affirmative action that they ended up adapting from the Russians. And here you're seeing an official that I'm going to show you in a minute. There was a lot of overlap between my research on the Chinese officials who maintained their political control in Xinjiang in the 20th century and the foreign archaeologists. In fact, it was when I started to try to find new sources that could give me ground level perspectives on the political history of Xinjiang in the first half of the 20th century. That's when I started to stumble across these foreign explorers, these foreign archaeologists, like the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, who met with the Xinjiang governor Sheng Shicai. This is a Han governor of the province who ruled from 1933 to 1944. And what I found was that the Chinese archives that I was relying on, they talked about a lot of stuff, many new perspectives that hadn't been seen before, but they didn't always give you the ground level perspective of what many of the locals thought about the Chinese administration on the ground. So I started looking at the diaries, the field diaries, the unpublished, unedited field diaries and correspondence of men like Sven Hedin, because they passed through many of the oases all along the Taklamakan Desert, and they would talk about things. They would have eyewitness observations about phenomenon that the Chinese official sources wouldn't always comment upon. And in the process of looking at these field diaries to see what sort of political insights that they could yield to supplement the Chinese perspective, I also began to find some surprising things. It seemed to me that every time someone like Sven Hedin or Aurel Stein or Paul Pelliot, these different Western archaeologists and explorers, every time they met with a Chinese official, such as Sheng Shicai, the diaries that talked about these meetings seemed to be quite positive. And I thought, well, this is strange because I know these guys are also at the exact same time removing tens of thousands of works of art and antiquity from northwestern China. Today, I know they're often habitually referred to in Chinese official discourse as thieves. How do I explain what appear to be quite positive interactions? So I went from trying to understand in my first work how the Chinese preserve political control over a non-Han land to trying to understand how they lost cultural control over the antiquities that were buried underneath that same sand, underneath the exact same land. Why did the Westerners come to this region? Why were these foreign explorers in northwestern China at all? They were chiefly attracted to what is often referred to as Gandharan art or scripts, paper and wood that left traces of scripts that recorded Indic languages or Indic scripts that were found in northwestern China, much to many people's surprise. Gandharan art, here you're seeing some specimens of this from an antiquity shop in the oasis of Khotan in 1922. What Gandharan art essentially is it is art that reveals reveals the legacy of the conquest of Alexander the Great and his Greek armies in the 4th century BC. He ends up in the region of present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even Central Asia, the vicinity of modern-day Uzbekistan, and the communities that are left behind when his soldiers settle down and merge with local Central Asian, Northwestern Indian communities. The art that gets produced has clear visible traces of Greek influences that merge with local Indian and Buddhist motifs. And then they were also finding scripts left in Indic languages as well. This was surprising. No one knew that these influences had gone this far north or northeast into Central Asia beyond what is now northwestern India. Inevitably, however, what they eventually found was a lot of Chinese material as well. They didn't go out looking for Chinese material, but once they were there, they found a lot of Chinese material, and that then got the Chinese interested in what they were doing as well. Now, among all of the archaeologists, Aurel Stein, the British archaeologist Aurel Stein, is probably the most important. He certainly did the most visits and took away the most materials from northwestern China. Here you see him here with a Chinese magistrate, Pan Zuhuan, in Kashgar in 1930. Aurel Stein is the one who is probably the most famous today as well, and I structured my study around his expeditions. I look at many different explorers and archaeologists, but he provides the bulk of the material, the evidence, the archival materials, and the interactions with local Chinese officials that I analyze in my research. Now, how did I come across his stuff? Well, I started looking at his diaries. These are pages from Stein's field diaries, which are today mostly held at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. I made several extended research trips to the Bodleian Library to take a look at these things. They are scattered in various archives throughout India, the former British archives in India, and in several places in Europe. Stein was actually born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, spoke Hungarian as a child, received his preliminary education in German, and then eventually took his PhD at Oxford, and then took a position in the British Civil Service in the Raj in India. He saw that as his easiest way to an academic post back in Europe, if he could get into the field, so to speak, in India. He was chiefly an Indologist who wanted to study Sanskrit materials, and it was his roamings around in northwestern India that eventually tipped him off to the idea that there was stuff in northwestern China that he should look at as well. Now, I knew that Stein had interacted with a lot of local Chinese officials in Xinjiang, and the impressions seemed to be positive. So when I went to the Bodleian Library and I looked at his papers, I was hoping I would find more. And I was really surprised to find a box of materials that were labeled Chinese papers from the archaeological expeditions throughout the entire time. Stein does 4 expeditions into northwestern China, 1900, 1906, 1913, and 1930. So he's a wonderful case study for several different decades in which radically different political environments are in play. And so we can see him doing 2 expeditions in the late Qing dynasty. We can see him doing 1 expedition right after the 1911 revolution in sort of a position, a climate of political instability, and then finally doing another one in the 1930s when you have Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party ascendant in southern China. So what did I find when I opened these boxes that were labeled Chinese materials? I didn't even know he had any Chinese materials in his archives. I expected it was just going to be his English language correspondence and field diaries. It blew my mind, sort of to exaggerate here a little bit, what I found in these boxes. He kept everything. He was a meticulous collector of all documentation concerning his expedition. It didn't matter that he actually didn't read Chinese. He tried to learn Chinese later on, but he was never fluent in Chinese. Still, he collected all this stuff and put it in his papers and bequeathed it to the Bodleian Library. This documents a ground level perspective, not only his own perspective, but also the perspective of the Chinese who were tasked with overseeing his expedition. Here you're seeing here on the left an envelope that is addressed to Stein from a Chinese official. There was probably a letter in here originally in Chinese. I'll show you some of those in a moment. On the right, this is an announcement. This is a public announcement that's being posted in a public area that is informing the local people. Here is this British archaeologist, Aurel Stein. This is what he's going to be doing. Help him out in this way. It's purely a bureaucratic logistical document about Stein's expedition, announcing to the locals what he's going to do. It was clear that Stein, from his papers, placed a very high emphasis and value on his relationship with the Chinese officials. They were only 5% of the population, if that, but their help was essential for the logistics of his expedition. Nothing could get done if the Chinese officials did not agree to do it. You need to rent camels, you need donkeys, you need to hire carpenters to build wooden crates to take stuff away. You need to hire local laborers. You need to buy food. You need to buy blocks of ice that you're going to carry into the desert and then melt for water in sub-zero temperatures. All of these things require the Chinese official to be on your side. And we can see Stein recognizing this fact. Here you have, this is one of several lists that I found in which he has a Chinese secretary that he's hired and is following with him, who is writing down the names and jurisdictions of every single Chinese official that he meets. Why? Because he's going to be maintaining a correspondence with them after he leaves. He wants to maintain a record of this. I found in his archives that he had retained all of his calling cards. Here is a the typical red slip of paper that was used. This is Stein's name in Chinese, the Dai Nuo. That's a Chinese transliteration of his name. He kept all of these calling cards. This is a huge stack. Here are 3 more. These are the names of Chinese officials. Every single time that you visit a new jurisdiction, you first send in your red calling card with your name in Chinese to the local official. They send you theirs, and then you arrange for a time to meet and discuss whatever sort of matters you need to be discussed before you head out to do your digging. Here is, again, Che Yuheng. I told you we would come back to him as well. This is the Chinese official, the picture that was taken of him that was taken by Stein. He met this guy, and we have Che Yuheng's calling card here on the left as well. This is important for several reasons that we're going to explore. What was being talked about in these interactions? Why were the Chinese officials seem to have a positive interaction with Stein? Why did he maintain such meticulous records of his meetings with them and maintain lists of who they were and whatnot? This was a rare social and political equal. These Chinese officials were out in a land in which they were an extreme minority of the population, and in their eyes, they saw the majority of the people over whom they ruled as vastly inferior in cultural and political terms to themselves, and they rarely interacted with them on equal social or political terms. When I was doing this project in my very early days in grad school, I remember actually going up to my advisor, Joseph Escherich, one of the great historians of Chinese history, and showing him some of the surprisingly positive interactions that Stein had with these local officials like Che Yuheng. And I was saying, what do you think of this? Why do they seem to like Stein so much? And Escherich told me, he said his first reaction was, maybe they were simply bored. Maybe they were simply bored. These are lonely officials posted out to the distant frontier in a land that they regard as culturally backward. I thought Professor Escherich was joking at the time period. Only in hindsight would I realize he was absolutely right. It was one of the things that attracted to them unexpected social bonds, which I'm going to talk about as a form of social capital. Now, these are other things that just sort of want to give you some of the diversity of the materials that I was able to look at to construct the argument that you see in my book. You have here, they were exchanging photos with one another. On the right, you have an envelope, again, a Chinese official wanting to send correspondence and a picture to Stein. They're sending pictures of themselves. And as I found out, Stein would send his picture of himself to the Chinese official as well. So it wasn't even just they were having positive interactions at the time, they were then following this up with correspondence and sending pictures of each other as well. Clearly there was something more than meets the eye. So what I eventually then started to look at was also in this box, there were letters, and this is in bright red, the bright red stationery. It's even turning my face red on the Zoom camera right now. There were many letters like this. Written on this standard red stationery that I find in the archives. And this was the gold mine. When I found this in 2013 on one of my early trips to the Bodleian Library, this is when I decided this is going to be something that needs to result in a book project. No longer do I just have little odds and ends and Stein's English language impressions. Now I have the words of the Chinese officials themselves, unedited, not intended for publication, directly writing to Stein. and telling him what they thought of him. Here is the exact same official who wrote that letter in the previous page. Aksu magistrate Zhu Ruichi. Stein will meet Zhu Ruichi on 3 of his 4 expeditions. At one point, he will write in his diary, on his second expedition, I just met with Zhu Ruichi again. He regarded me as a Lao Pengyo, an old friend. What does Zhu say in his letter? If you can read Chinese, it's not easy to read. This is a very difficult form of Chinese. He is telling Stein in one of the most striking passages that everything you do, dear sir, confers luster on the sands of the Gobi Desert and distinction on the peaks of the Kunlun Mountains. At one point here on the right, he tells him that what I admire is the suffering and the perseverance that you exhibit in trying to undertake your archaeological endeavors. Other letters that I found, here's Stein, an English translation. Even though he couldn't read Chinese, you might be asking, well, how does he know what they're writing? He would procure an English language translation. This is the English language translation that Stein procured of his Chinese letter from Zhu Ruichi. It's an awkward translation. It's not the best, but the gist of what Zhu Ruichi had written to Stein is included in this English language translation. Stein wrote English back to the officials, and then they would have that translated into Chinese because most of them didn't read English either. Other things that I found, you see these also in my book. Li Shurong, the magistrate of Barakol, he met with Stein 7 times over a stay of 6 days in his town, writing in here that you practice archaeology with a perseverance that is simply unheard of in this world. Another letter from Keria magistrate Dai Chengmo starts off here by saying that he has all these distinguished friends throughout the entire world. He's traveled all over Europe, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, many different ports of call. And he says, I know a lot of pretty incredible people, but none is the equal of Aurel Stein, who I befriended in 1913 when he visited my oasis. So equipped with this is not just sort of, oh, the Chinese officials seem to like him. This is serious, effusive praise, over the top, in unedited private correspondence that was not intended for publication. Now I decided, all right, I need to do an entire reevaluation of what the Chinese thought of these foreign explorers from his first expeditions in the late Qing Empire until his last expedition in 1930 under Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party. Here you have Stein's passport in the early days, his second expedition from 1906, issued by the Qing Empire in Beijing, and I would finish in 1930 and 1931 with his 4th and final expedition. This is Stein's passport under Chiang Kai-shek's regime in Nanjing in the southern part of China until 1930. I want to understand all possible perspectives. Anyone that Stein or any of the explorers bumped into, I want to know, what did the locals think of him? What did the Chinese think of him? The political elites, the educated elites? What did the mostly uneducated, mostly illiterate, mostly poor Muslims who comprise the majority of the population here, what did they think of him? And how, most importantly, does he change from the hero that he clearly is perceived as in those early letters to a thief, which we know he's going to become in the 1920s and 30s. He will be unequivocally referred to as a thief who has stolen China's priceless heritage. And what I found, what I'm going to do in the remainder of my talk, 15, 20 minutes or so, is give you an overview of the compensations of plunder. And that's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek phrase. What I really mean are the compensations of cooperation. You cooperate with me in doing my expedition. What will you get out of it? Either knowingly or unknowingly, what does the foreign archaeologist offer in exchange for what he wants to do? And I also place this in comparative context with archaeological expeditions everywhere throughout the world. So what do I find? I find 4 different forms of capital. Forms of capital that were exchanged as part of these archaeological expeditions. Stein et al. Are going to take away art and antiquities, and the locals, from the Chinese official on high to the Muslim laborers down low, will deem what he's removing, the tangible objects he's removing, as being of lesser value than what they're getting in return, even if Stein doesn't always realize what he's giving them in return. What are these 4 forms of capital? I've come up with political capital, social capital, economic capital, and diplomatic capital. To give you a comparative example, so we're not just talking about Chinese in terms that may be a little bit more familiar to you, here is a painting of Lord Elgin removing what has become known as the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. I see this as a form of diplomatic capital. What's going on here, essentially, in a nutshell, is that Lord Elgin is the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, the most important person politically from the British Empire in the year 1800 is when he arrives in Constantinople. He says that he would like to excavate on the Acropolis and take away some marbles. He originally wanted to make plaster casts, and he applies for a firman, a document from the Sultan in Constantinople that will allow his men to remove what he wants to remove. He has trouble getting this document until political events come to the rescue. What happened at the time was that the French had invaded the Ottoman province of Egypt, and the Ottomans wanted Egypt back. When the British, for their own selfish reasons, decide to kick the French out of Egypt and return Egypt to the Ottomans, that's when Lord Elgin receives his firman. It is a form of diplomatic capital. And I often like to say that the true price value at the time, not in hindsight, at the time, the true value of the Elgin marbles was the return of Egypt. That's what the Ottomans were getting out of this exchange. And as the political representation, the political embodiment of the British Empire and its return of the Egyptian province to the Ottoman, the Sultan decides to give him a firman that allows him to do what he does. Take something that is culturally disconnected from the present day inhabitants. We perceive that as being of lesser value, and in exchange, we get something of great value back, the province of Egypt. That's a form of diplomatic capital. Also from Egypt, there are many different ancient obelisks that have become known colloquially as Cleopatra's Needles. There are many of these in Europe and North America. Some of the most famous are in New York. Here's Cleopatra's Needle in New York, still in Central Park today. Here's the one, I believe, in Paris. These are forms of diplomatic capital. There's also one in London. What you eventually have in the 19th century are different pashas, the preeminent ruler in Cairo in Egypt, who basically voluntarily gives these as gifts to various European and North American countries to sweeten up diplomatic deals, things that otherwise would be very difficult to achieve, trade concessions, tariff concessions, maybe, this will sweeten the deal in an alliance against our common enemy. This is something that the Pasha in Cairo regards as being of little value to him, but he realizes that the Westerners see this as being of great value. I can give you something that is not of great value to me, but of great value to you, and it'll help sweeten a diplomatic deal. This is a form of diplomatic capital. This is also a more recent example in the 1960s. The Temple of Dendur was going to be flooded by a dam project in Egypt, and the Americans came in and offered various engineering devices to help remove some of the antiquities that were going to be flooded to get them to a safer, higher ground from the dam, which was going to flood them. And as thanks, or as part of the thanks, the Egyptian state, as late as the 1960s, gave as a gift to the United States an entire Temple of Dendur. This, again, is another form of diplomatic capital. The things that antiquities can be exchanged for prior to an age in which we now infuse among them a priceless valuation. When they're not yet priceless, what can they be exchanged for? Diplomatic capital is one of the most common. Back to China. An example of Chinese antiquities being used as diplomatic capital. In 1905, the famous Qing dynasty diplomat Duanfang, he went on the constitutional mission around the world in which Qing dynasty officials wanted to reform, and they wanted to observe the political systems of Europe and North America and report back to see how China could best reform. When Duanfang visited Chicago and saw the very new Field Museum at that time period, he gave as a gift an ancient Taoist stele from, I believe, the 5th century BC, something that we would today regard as priceless. He is trying to ingratiate himself with his Chinese host, with his American host, another form of diplomatic capital. Now let's get back to the archaeological expeditions in northwestern China that I use as my extended case study. Here what you're looking at is the preface, the Chinese preface to a Chinese translation of Stein's preliminary report from his first expedition in 1900 to 1901. After he's done, he writes a preliminary report, about 100 pages in English, sends this to Chinese officials. It makes its way up to the Chinese governor, a man by the name of Rao Yingqi, in 1901. He wants to see what Stein wrote about his expedition. He commissions a translation into Chinese. A man by the name of Wan Rong translates it into English and then writes this preface. this preface in which he gives his own assessment of what Stein means to him. This is, again, I'm trying to recover Chinese contemporary voices, and the less edited, the less censored they are, the better, because we're getting a true idea of what the Chinese thought of Stein at the time period. Here you have my notes all over it. I had to scan this. This is, again, difficult classical style Chinese that this is written in. This represents what I refer to as a form of political capital as distinct from diplomatic capital. What Wan Rong essentially says here, if you can read Chinese, you can probably see this fairly easily. What he essentially says is that Stein is a emblem of modern Western science. He is an emblem of Western modernity. And this is a time period when the Chinese are in a headlong attempt to reform along Western lines, to Westernize essentially, and they're looking for ways to change their polity, their culture, their administration, their educational system. And Wan Rong, the assistant to the governor, is writing here in this preface. It's a highly positive assessment of Stein in 1902. And he says at one point, those of you, he's talking to his fellow Chinese officials, those of you who see Stein crossing through rivers and climbing up mountains and you laugh at him, that's just being ignorant. This is a walking embodiment of everything that makes the West powerful and wealthy. He represents modern Western science, and we should be praising him and emulating him, not laughing at him. The Confucian gentleman, with his aversion to manual labor, Wan Rong is ridiculing them. This is a form of political capital. He's using Stein as a rod to beat his fellow officials with and say, you need to be more like Stein, not less like Stein. Social capital. Here is another one of those letters. It should be a fairly obvious form of capital, but what I realized is that for these lonely, elitist officials posted out to the northwestern frontier, Stein was a coveted form of social capital. They found that they had unexpected social and political bonds with a rare social equal, and they often could interact with someone like Stein in a way they would not do with anyone else. In this letter by a Chinese official named Wang Ming, he writes back to Stein in 1925 saying, thank you for your recent letter. I'm sorry, my father, who your letter was intended for, who you met on previous expeditions, he has sadly passed away. He didn't get to read your letter, but if he could have, who knows how high his exuberance would have enabled him to leap. And then he says here in the part that I've outlined, he says, whenever I think back about my father, I remember that every time he chatted with his friends, he would change the subject to talk about your amazing perseverance and how you would do things that no other mere mortal had ever done before. Stein was a scientific celebrity on horseback. They regarded him exactly like the Westerners did at the time period, as a hero, not as a thief, someone that they wanted to be more like. They clearly were not using the discourse of criminalization. Nowhere until the 1920s do you ever see in the Chinese source space the use of criminal language such as plunder, theft, steal. These words simply, you will not find them if you look in the source material. Then I also wanted to understand the lower classes, not just the Chinese perspective. I had a good idea: political capital, diplomatic capital, social capital. Why do the local Muslim laborers, or if he's in inner China, why do the local Chinese laborers, why do they work for him? They didn't have to work for him. Why do they do so? And so I looked into the question of economic capital. What are the locals getting out of this? Political, social capital, that's not something that's on tap for the lower illiterate classes. Economic capital is, they're poor. They want to make some money. Most expeditions take place in the winter season, the agricultural slack season. And I found in trying to interrogate what forms of economic capital were on tap, the work of Ellsworth Huntington was essential. He was the rare American, and he often commented on things that the Europeans took for granted, such as rigid economic and social segregation of different classes. And he would give us a great idea of the wages that were on tap, that were given to local guides and laborers. I don't have time to go into it here, but what I concluded based on his assessment is that they were quite high. They were attractive wages that were being put out. There was also a system of incentives for rewards if the locals could find additional sites and lead the archaeologists to different sites as well. In addition to wages, however, there were also other things that the mostly illiterate, poor lower classes got. Here is a rare group photo of Stein in the center, sitting with his assistants, his Indian assistants on the right that he brought with him from the British Raj, his one Chinese secretary seated to him on the left here, and then on the far left, a Muslim Uyghur by the name of Ibrahim Beg, his camel factotum. I just want to give you a sense of the laborers who worked for a man like Stein. but it's from Ellsworth Huntington's letters that I found a fascinating example of some of the economic capital that was on tap. I have this wonderful passage from Huntington's letters in which he says that he brought his Uyghur guide, a man by the name of Daoud, into his audience with the governor of Xinjiang, something that a man like Daoud would never be able to get on his own. And his letter goes like this. He says, I asked the governor, Governor Lian Kui, to give Daoud the post of village headman. The governor promised to do so, and when he called on me, he asked to see the man. Poor Daoud, most horribly frightened, was brought in, and after falling on his knees at the door and bowing his close-shaven head to the ground half a dozen times, advanced nearer to be looked at. I suppose it was the great experience of his life, one that he will boast of till his death. For as Ibrahim said, a man like that could not procure a personal interview with the governor if he paid $5,000. Here we have one of his assistants, Ibrahim, actually putting a price tag on the audience with the governor. Even if he had $5,000, you couldn't get an interview with the Chinese governor like Huntington could do. And Huntington and other explorers will use that leverage to procure promotions for men like Daoud. And we find out, I've traced in the correspondence how individual figures will be promoted into more lucrative administrative posts every single time that they help the foreigner undertake his archaeological expeditions. Now, I also need to, as part of this study, I need to find out what was the Chinese valuation of the things that were being taken away. How did they view this? Obviously, they got valuable compensations of cooperation in return. How does that sort of square away with how they interacted with antiquities themselves? And what I found is that before the 20th century, what you essentially have is that the Chinese, like most other educated and wealthy elites throughout the world, they saw the art and antiquities in their possession as a reflection of private virtue. Antiquities and art were privately owned, and they reflected the owner's own personal virtue, usually something that was marshaled to talk about how much of a gentleman, a cultivated gentleman that they were. So one of my case studies was the manuscripts that were found from the secret cave library in Dunhuang in northwestern China. They emerged from the cave over the first decade of the 20th century. We don't have time to go into the details of how this happened, but I wanted to look at these manuscripts that came out of this cave. And we know many Chinese officials got their own copy of these manuscripts. How could they help us understand how the Chinese interacted with these, the same sort of antiquities that the foreigners were taking away? Stein took away 10,000 of these manuscripts as well when he visited the cave of Dunhuang in 1907. And so I started looking at colophons, the sort of comments that were appended on the end of these documents. Here you see the ancient Buddhist Sutra on the right. On the far left is the modern Chinese colophon added by a Chinese official in the 20th century. These are manuscripts that were already 1,000 years old. They come into the possession of Chinese officials. They write their own thoughts on them. We're seeing them turn the manuscript into their own privately held possession, and they can insert themselves into the manuscript. This isn't a sterile artifact behind a glass window for the edification of the masses to teach them about their history. This is a privately owned work of art that the owner thinks he has a right to insert his own thoughts into it. It's still a living artifact in his mind. Anyone who's ever seen a Chinese painting is familiar with this practice in which wealthy Chinese officials and political figures will add their own seals onto paintings that might already be 500 years old. They don't see it as something that you, put away in a box and, it's not supposed to be touched. It's priceless. This is something that you continue to inscribe your own thoughts and identity into it. And I started looking at these colophons of these antiquities. The Westerners took these away, and they took them away to a library, a university, and said, this is a priceless emblem of the Chinese nation. It's not to be transferred again. We can't insert ourselves into it. You don't alter the manuscript in theory. The Chinese took this and they treated it as a form of private capital that could be transferred. Here's a colophon party, as I like to deem it. A Chinese gentleman invites his friends and colleagues over, and what you see here are many different notations, colophons that are added by the members, by people who are invited to this party. The host is trying to impress his guests. Oftentimes, he will then also give away some of these manuscripts. Here is one colophon to a Dunhuang manuscripts in which we're seeing someone talk about how this manuscript has been cut up multiple times. They've actually cut the manuscript up so they can give it away as a gift to as many colleagues as possible. This is a form of capital. It's a form of ingratiating yourselves with your social peers, with your political superiors, and you're hoping to get something even more valuable in return, even if it requires cutting up the manuscript. The most important point I took away from this, however, is that these are transferable commodities, privately owned transferable commodities. They're not yet a priceless emblem of the Chinese nation. They're precious and they're profitable to the lower classes or the upper classes, but they're not seen as priceless. They can still be given away. They can still be transferred. And that's different than what the Westerners are doing. And when the Chinese see the Westerners taking these things, they see it in very similar terms. They're just doing what we already do. They're accumulating culture. And these things are also owned by private individuals. Now I end my story, apologies for the time, I just have a few more minutes here. I end my story with trying to understand, how did the Chinese view change? At what point do they go from saying you are a hero, a heroic man of science who is doing things that no one's ever done before, to saying that you are a thief and you're stealing this heritage from the Chinese nation? How do we get to that point? That transition occurs, it starts to occur after World War I. Okay, and what you find is after World War I, you're going to see a transition in multiple arenas in China, in which various institutions that hold art and antiquities will go from privately owned collections to being transformed into priceless emblems of the nation. Here you have the old view. This is the boy Emperor Puyi who abdicates the throne at age 6 in 1912. Here he is on the rooftops of the Forbidden City for 12 years until he's kicked out of the Forbidden City in 1924. He treats the art and antiquities that are in the Forbidden City as the private possession of his clan, the Aisin-Gyoro Manchu clan that formed the ruling house, and he sold it. He sold it in order to raise money for his living expenses. He did not regard these as emblems of the Chinese nation. That will change over the course of the 1920s. It changes when the Chinese begin to adopt the Western archaeologist view of art and antiquities as abstract emblems of their collective, not exclusive, nation. It's now the basis of political legitimacy and thus priceless. For this, they needed Western education. And I don't mean to impugn the motives of the Chinese, who had been collecting, preserving, and admiring antiquities far longer than the Westerners had been doing themselves. Their tradition goes way back, at least 1,000 years. But when they started to get a Western education and the first generation of Westernized Chinese intellectuals comes of age in the 1920s, this is when they start to view these art and antiquities as priceless in the exact same way that the Westerners do. Now they represent the Chinese nation, and you have to protect and preserve these things to have political legitimacy and put yourself up as a ruler of the nation. The first Chinese, Westernized Chinese intellectual who will actually undertake an obstruction of a Western expedition will be Hong Ye. It's notable that he also had an English name, which was indicative of the fact that he spent much time in America and was educated at Harvard. It will be William Hong in 1925, who will be the first Westernized Chinese to obstruct an expedition of the Westerners. It will be the Harvard art historian Langdon Warner when he tries to go to Dunhuang and peel away Chinese paintings from the caves of the Thousand Buddha caves. You have to have Westernized Chinese. You have to have a national museum. And by 1925, you have the National Palace Museum. The Forbidden City is turned from what was literally a forbidden city. It was forbidden to the Chinese nation. Now it undergoes a dramatic transformation to the National Palace Museum. It's the complete opposite, from a forbidden city that represents the exclusive virtue of the ruling family to the collective heritage of the abstract, newly invented Chinese nation that is now the basis of political legitimacy. Now you have the institutions and the mindset in place to start criminalizing what two sides both regard as priceless. Now the Chinese are treating the art and antiquities of their country in exactly the same way as the Westerners, not as merely profitable or merely precious, but a priceless abstract symbol of the collective nation upon which political legitimacy now rests in the age of nationalism. How do the Westerners start to react when they begin to be obstructed? Here's where I end my story. They react by mocking the initiative and audacity of what they refer to as backward natives. I end with this fairly ugly racist cartoon from 1937. I found this in the archives of the American paleontologist Roy Chapman Andrews, who did many expeditions to Chinese-held territories of Mongolia in the 19-teens and 20s. He began to be obstructed in 1928 as well. And he responded by saying, you know, why would I ever share my expedition with the Chinese? I pay for everything, and then I have to leave the proceeds of my expedition in China. If I did this, my expedition will be turned into Roy's charity organization, and I have no intention of doing charity for the Chinese. Of course, you want to take things away. And I found this cartoon from the Saturday Evening Post. It was really hard to track down where it came from. This was cut out and included in a letter from Langdon Warner, the art historian from Harvard who had been obstructed in 1925 by William Hung. This was included in a letter from Langdon Warner to Roy Chapman Andrews in 1937. He cut it out of the Saturday Evening Post. And, you know, basically they were both taking solace in their idea that even though they had been obstructed by the Chinese, they were still laughing at the idea that any non-Western, non-white person would ever undertake an expedition to a civilized land to take things away. Clearly, expeditions are what civilized white men do in lands with dark-skinned peoples. That was the racist, ugly ideology of the day, and that brings to an end the era of the compensations of cooperation, which now becomes reframed as plunder. Thank you very much. My apologies for going a few minutes longer than I intended to. I hope we still have 15, 20 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was excellent. And yeah, we've still got about 15 minutes for Q&A. So plenty of time, really. And anybody can either raise your hand, or you can type something in the chat. You can virtually raise your hand, or if your video is on, you can just do an analog hand raise and jump in. And Ava and anybody else, if you want to jump in with questions. I know we have some folks who are affiliated through the RAFMA, so there was a lot of comparative interest here. The RAFMA, by the way, Justin, if you're not familiar, is a really fantastic museum. I'm sure you took a quick look at their website, but they have a really fantastic Egypt collection. Yeah. And lots more. And my colleague Kate Liska is in, and Ava and Miranda and everybody there do really, really terrific work. So we're lucky to have those guys in. I'm sort of vamping a little bit until anybody comes in with a question, and if they don't, I will pull rank, because I got buckets of questions. It'll be just like our old seminars.
All right.
but let's hold on just a second, see if anybody jumps into the chat or sort of virtually raises their hands here. Why don't I go ahead and ask a quick question, Justin, and you can take it whatever direction you want. But to what extent was the fact that these were largely Buddhist artifacts and texts a reason for not more aggressively protecting them early on? And you talked about the modernity and a lot of other ideas that made Stein very, very much praised. But these, you talked about the Chinese materials being found a little bit later, the sort of culturally Chinese, and you can say that these Buddhist texts were in some ways Chinese as well, especially when they're in the Chinese language. But were they more protective of Islamic texts or non-Chinese Buddhist materials in that region?
That's an excellent question. What I found is initially most of the Chinese, when they started to realize that Chinese language materials were being found, they didn't have much interest in the non-Chinese stuff, things that were related to Indian scripts, Central Asian cultures, Tibetan culture, Muslim history. These were things that the Westerners were more interested in usually, and the Chinese generally did not take much of an interest in them. Now, the Chinese officials, most of the stuff that came out was of a Buddhist character of some sort. If it was statues, if it was sort of like that picture that I showed there, you know, sort of Buddhist wall murals, heads of statues and whatnot of the Buddha or bodhisattvas. They didn't have a whole lot of interest in that stuff either. They generally regarded that as something that was for the edification of what they regarded as the vulgar, illiterate masses, not something that a Confucian gentleman would be interested in. But anything that had Chinese script on it, steles, manuscripts, and especially stuff that came out of the secret cave library from Dunhuang in the first decade of the 20th century. If there was Chinese writing of any sort, they were very interested in these things. And I tried to document, I tried to look at the source material, and I found from the very beginning, although most of what Stein is taking away is not Chinese in the beginning, it's clear in his audiences with Chinese officials, he's showing them the Chinese material that he has from the very beginning. So it's not as though they say, oh, you're taking away Central Asian, Indian stuff, Persian stuff, whatever, I'm not really interested in this. And then once they finally find it's Chinese, oh, stop, you're a thief because I want this. That's not the case. They know from the very beginning that Chinese things are being found, not all of it entirely of a Buddhist character. When Stein goes to Dunhuang in 1907, he makes the discovery of what are known as the Han limes from the Han Empire, these military fortifications that were on the frontier from the Han Empire almost 2,000 years earlier, and he finds these bamboo slips with Chinese on them. These are really valuable secular political material, not Buddhist. This is as early as 1907, and I have documentation in the diaries and Chinese letters. Thanks for showing me these slips from the Han Dynasty. It was incredible, and yet they're not saying hey, you shouldn't be taking this stuff away. And even when it was Buddhist material, if it was written in Chinese, like a Buddhist sutra, most of the Chinese elites weren't terribly into Buddhism. Some of them were, but most of them weren't like, hardcore religious Buddhist adherents, but they still valued the calligraphy. If there was a Buddhist sutra, a copy of the Lotus Sutra that was from the 8th century AD from the Tang Dynasty, they may not really have cared too much about the content of that sutra, but they were fascinated by the calligraphy in which that sutra had been written. And the vast majority of comments on those colophons that I was looking at are about calligraphy. It's just, look how beautiful this calligraphy is. Which calligrapher is, is this an evidence of someone who studied under this famous Tang Dynasty calligrapher? They did regard that as extremely precious, and they were interested from the earliest days.
Thanks, Justin. And many of the officials wouldn't have been interested in Buddhism until after they retire, right? That's the Chinese. Right. Buddhism and Taoism get interesting after they retire. In the meantime,
that's actually true. I found some of the later colophons from the 1940s, in which you have these old men who are retiring from their posts in the Northwest, going back to the Eastern Seaboard. You're right. They do seem to be more interested in the religious aspects of these sutras in old age than they were when they were younger.
So he goes to the active serving Confucian officials and they say, go ahead, get it out of here. I won't care for that for another 30 years. We do have two good questions in the chat. I don't know if you can access that, Justin, from my colleague in history, Kate Liska, who is our liaison, who made the connection between the Modern China talks and Ava.
When Stein and the others, this is from Kate, when Stein and the others were gathering antiquities in China, did they need to give anything to China in return as payment, or was it just the economic impact they brought to the local community? So the way it worked, and much of my talk and the book, basically the argument is saying that there are unseen, undetected compensations that occurred when you recover the on-site interactions of the local Chinese officials who facilitated the logistics and the local laborers who lent their muscle to actually carry out the dig. Everyone at every stage of the economic classes of society are receiving something in return that they regard as more valuable, more precious than what is being removed, because they don't yet view this stuff as priceless emblems of the nation. And they're getting something in return, whether it's economic capital, political capital, social capital, or diplomatic capital. As far as the logistics of how you get permission to do a dig, it starts off by applying to the central government in Beijing. Your ambassador for your country will submit an application to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs at this time pretty much invariably approved the application. They would issue a passport. That passport would be sent to the foreign explorer. He would enter whatever part of China he had permission to enter and meet with the local officials. They would approve the passport. And pretty much the passport says, don't hinder him, don't obstruct him, don't let him get hurt, or else the unequal treaties will be invoked and we'll be in big trouble. But beyond that, they didn't have to do a whole lot. And what I was able to recover in the letters and correspondence and field diaries is abundant evidence that the Chinese officials went out of their way to help out. Not just, here you go. Here's some camels. Here's how what you can do. It was, I heard about a site 20 miles into the desert. Make sure you check this out. And I can't wait to see what you find, even though they know he's going to take it away. To answer your question, I guess very directly, the central administration, the central government in Beijing is not receiving anything unless you think of the approval of an archaeological application as a form of diplomatic capital, which is essentially, if you approve what is being presented to you as a scientific expedition meant to further our understanding of the ancient world, then approving that application is one way of showing the foreign powers that you are a modern scientific country yourself. Don't look down on us anymore. Don't mock us for being backward Oriental despots or whatnot. We're just as scientific as you. We appreciate scientific inquiry. So yes, we'll approve an archaeological expedition like this. When did it, another question from Mary, when did it become common in Egypt to split the found objects between Egypt and the archaeologist?
And Justin, I want to jump in actually just by way of quick introduction to let you know that Kate is an Egyptologist and has an active site, Al-Hudi, in Egypt right now. And so on Mary's question, it's possible that Kate might want to jump in here as well. But please go ahead with your response.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, in preparation for my book, the case study, the extended case study with the evidence in China, I actually spent several years trying to read all the literature I could about archaeological expeditions elsewhere around the world. And so I became quite familiar with the situation in places like Egypt as well, to understand how does this compare with what I'm seeing in China. And I developed this course, Indiana Jones in History, at my university, where I sort of teach the entire global situation and then present China as a case study and to put it in context. And my understanding, and Kate, please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that what's known as partage, the division of archaeological proceeds between Westerners and the Egyptian authorities in Egypt, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that begins in the 1870s, soon after Heinrich Schliemann does his nefarious stuff at the dig at Troy. They start to push for a system of splitting proceeds. Usually the Westerners still got the best stuff, but nevertheless, there was a system in place by, I think it's the 1870s, called partage. Is that correct, Kate?
I can't confirm on Kate's behalf, but I can note that she just sent a quick note to say, I didn't mean to put her on the spot, and she sent me a quick note to say that her daughter's schooling behind her. So rather than unmute, she's typed us here, 1880, when Gaston Maspero becomes the head of the antiquities system.
Right. So late 19th century.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Justin.
Well, what's also, I would just note what's also really interesting is that the period of obstruction of Western archaeologists is almost the same anywhere in the entire world. Doesn't matter when the expeditions began, whether they began with Napoleon and Lord Elgin in the early 19th century, or they began in China relatively late with the turn of the 20th century. The age of obstruction is uniformly after World War I, with the creation of new independent states who are looking for a new political identity for their newly invented nation, and they look to the art and antiquities of the past as the basis for the identity of that new nation. This is why Howard Carter, excavating at the tomb of Tutankhamun in November 1922, if he had found the tomb of Tutankhamun in any of the 6 field seasons he had been working there previously, the vast majority of those objects would have ended up in the British Museum or the Metropolitan Museum, but he discovered it right as Egypt became independent, and nothing left Egypt as a result. They managed to obstruct them and keep everything. Same with China, it's the 1920s.
I was thinking of the May 4th there, and that sort of
right. That's your first generation
awakening
of westernized Chinese intellectuals who have received either an education abroad, or they've gone to Japan and received a Japanese-mediated Western education, or simply the trickle-down effect. They're now thinking as the Westerners think with regard to the political value of antiquities as emblems of the abstract nation.
Speaking of Japan, can I ask one more question? I don't see any more in the chat or any hands, but everybody should feel free if you want to get one more question in. Mine was about Stein's particular background. I'm not sure if this was the same for Pelliot and others. He had a bit of a transnational kind of background that he came in with, and so that sort of lent itself to that global modernity to some extent. Did there were increasingly, I know in Hainan and other places, Japanese ethnographers and archaeologists and that kind of thing, because of, certainly since 1895, but even before that, the tension between Qing China and then Republican China, was there a more of a negative default approach to Japanese archaeologists who were coming in the teens, 20s, 30s?
That's an excellent question. There were, and I didn't really mention this, and it doesn't play a huge part in my book either, because the Japanese expeditions to northwestern China are not well documented. Actually, a lot of the materials are destroyed or dispersed. It's hard actually to do research on it. But surprisingly, at the exact same time that Stein and all the other Western archaeologists were doing these Silk Road expeditions, the Japanese were in there too. They were in there. It's not later in the 1960s, 1920s. They're in there in the first decade of the 20th century. It's a Count Otani Kozui leads 4 different expeditions, or pays for 4 different expeditions at the same time as Stein's first 3 expeditions. They're interested in the exact same thing. They look at this era and they say these Chinese antiquities are largely coming out of an era in which Chinese culture during the Tang Dynasty was exported to Japan. So they trace the origins of Japanese culture to the era that is dated to these antiquities as well. They're fascinated by it, and they take an enormous amount of material out of China as well. As far as the Chinese reactions to them, the answer is no. I don't see any evidence that the Japanese were regarded as any different than the Western archaeologists. They too were, Westernized gentlemen who were doing an admirable thing, and it was an emblem of modern science that the Chinese wanted to imitate themselves. There was no sense of, well, the Westerners are good, but the Chinese, they're imperialists who are preying on China, so therefore we're going to think of you differently. No. And in fact, many of the early Chinese scholars, such as Luo Zhenyu and Wang Guowei, who were very prominent in the late Qing and early Republican era, they would eventually take refuge in Japan. They would relocate to Tokyo and become very close with many Japanese scholars as well.
This is so fascinating. There's so many implications, and then the connection to I want to know what happened around the Boxers and all these other things. There's such a we could talk all day, I think. And I want to turn it back over to Eva to wrap things up. I want to thank Professor Jacobs for joining us. Thanks to Eva. And Professor Liska and everybody for making this collaboration with RAFMA possible. I hope the first of many, and I hope in better days, Justin's going to come make his way across country and visit our students and visit the RAFMA.
Can't wait.
You'll always be welcome. Thanks so much, Justin. It's always great to see you.
Thank you for arranging this, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Take care.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Jeremy. And we'll welcome you in our next event sometime very soon.
All right.
Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.